If you look back at the 20th century, probably the single scariest time in world history was the Cold War.
Oh, for sure.
After World War II, you end up with these two giants left standing, the United States and the Soviet Union. And they almost immediately become these competing superpowers.
And that competition was driven really by this intense fear. It led straight into this massive nuclear arms race.
Right.
Both nations just started building these enormous stockpiles of weapons. The thinking at the time was pretty brutal but simple. The more weapons we have, the safer we are.
But that logic just spirals out of control, doesn't it? We're talking about bombs that can wipe entire cities off the map, and they're being mass-produced.
And by the late 1960s, a really staggering realization hits leaders in both Washington and Moscow. They realize they have enough firepower to destroy the entire planet, not just once, but many times over.
And the cost must have been just crushing.
Crushing their economies. You're spending billions on weapons you hope you never, ever have to use. The logistics of just maintaining thousands of these missiles was unsustainable. So the only logical next step was to find a way to limit the missiles without looking weak.
So that's what we're unpacking today. We're going to get into the really difficult diplomatic process that created the strategic arms limitation talks. You've probably heard of them as SALT V and SALT II.
And this was a huge deal. It was the world's first real attempt to freeze and control the most dangerous technology humans had ever made. And the level of distrust, it was just off the charts.
Okay, so let's start with SALT I. The talks had been in the works for a while, but they officially kick off in November 1969. They held the meetings in Helsinki and Vienna.
And the main goal of SALT, well, it sounds simple. Freeze the number of strategic ballistic missile launchers at their current levels.
So not getting rid of any, just stopping the assembly line.
Exactly. Just stop making more. But even that was incredibly complex. I mean, what counts as a launcher? Is it a silo? A tube on a submarine? They spent months just debating the definitions.
Wow.
But this was a monumental first step. The first time these two huge rivals ever agreed to sit down and legally limit their own power. The negotiations were just brutal because nobody trusted the other side's real intentions.
So what was the big breakthrough? How did they actually make it happen?
It came down to a really counterintuitive idea, and it was the most important part of the whole agreement. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The ABM Treaty.
ABM. So those are the defensive missiles, right? The ones designed to shoot down incoming nukes.
Exactly. They're basically shields.
Yeah.
And you'd think if you want peace, you'd want the best shield possible, right?
Hold on. I want to dig into that. Why would you sign a treaty that limits your ability to defend yourself? Why agree to be more vulnerable?
Well, that's the dark, surprising logic of the Cold War. Leaders were worried that if one country felt it had a perfect defense, a perfect shield,
They might be tempted to attack first.
they might be tempted to launch a first strike, yeah, because they wouldn't fear getting hit back. So by limiting defenses, both nations stayed vulnerable.
And that shared vulnerability is what created the stability.
Exactly. That's the concept we all know as mutual assured destruction, or MAD. It meant neither side would start a war because they knew, for a fact, they would be destroyed in the retaliation.
So the ABM treaty actually made that official. It limited each country to only 2 ABM sites, one to protect the capital city and the other to protect one missile base.
That's it. They were legally agreeing to be vulnerable. A terrifying idea, but it worked. It stopped the defensive arms race in its tracks.
Okay, so alongside that defensive treaty, SALT, I also had an agreement about offensive weapons, the missiles that actually do the attacking.
Right, an interim agreement. It was for 5 years, and it put a freeze on the number of land-based and submarine-based missile launchers.
And when they signed this in Moscow in 1972, the numbers weren't even, were they?
Not at all. The Soviet Union actually had way more launchers. But, and this is the key, the United States had much more advanced technology.
So that was the trade-off.
Yeah.
The Soviets got to keep their higher number of launchers.
In exchange for the U.S. not moving forward on some of its own new missile programs, the U.S. was okay with the numbers being off because they knew their missiles were just better, more accurate.
But this is where that huge, immediate loophole shows up.
A massive one.
SALT, I only froze the launchers, the silos, the tubes. It did not limit the number of warheads, the actual bombs, that you could put on a single missile.
And this was happening right as a new technology called MIRVs was coming online. Multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles.
So before MIRVs, it was one missile, one bomb.
One missile, one bomb. After MIRVs, one missile could carry 10, even more, warheads. And each one could hit a different city.
So you could multiply your firepower by 10 without building a single new launcher. The freeze was almost instantly obsolete.
The arms race didn't stop. It just became more sophisticated. The number of actual bombs skyrocketed right after SALT was signed.
Still, despite that flaw, you have to say, signing SALT was a landmark moment. It kicked off this period of cooling tensions that we call detente.
It really did. It proved that compromise was possible, that these two rivals could actually sit down and put legal limits on their weapons.
But, critics at the time, especially in the U.S. military, they didn't really buy it. They thought detente was just a trick.
They thought the Soviets were just buying time to catch up technologically while the U.S. was distracted.
Which brings up the biggest technical problem in all of this: verification. How do you know the other side isn't cheating? You can't just send inspectors to their top-secret military bases.
You can't, so they had to rely on high-tech surveillance. The official term was National Technical Means of Verification.
Which is a fancy way of saying spy satellites.
Spy satellites, yeah. And electronic surveillance. We're talking about satellites flying in orbit, taking incredibly detailed photos of missile silos, of submarine pens. Then specialists on the ground would analyze those images to count weapons and look for new construction.
And the treaty actually protected this.
It did. Both sides promised not to interfere with the other satellites, no blinding them, no jamming their signals. It basically made spying from space a legal part of arms control.
And without that, the whole thing would have fallen apart. That was the only way to build even a tiny bit of trust.
So SALT, it was groundbreaking, but its big success-freezing launchers was immediately undercut by that MIRV technology. Both sides were still building up their destructive power like crazy.
Which led directly to the next round of talks, SALT II. They started in late 1972 and would go on for 7 years.
7 very difficult years. The goal this time was much bigger. They wanted a permanent treaty, one that set limits on the total number of all nuclear weapons and, crucially, close that MIRV loophole for good.
The final SALT II treaty was, hundreds of pages long?
Yeah.
Super technical?
Incredibly technical. It was all about creating nuclear equality or parity. It set an initial limit of 2,400 strategic nuclear delivery vehicles for each side.
And a delivery vehicle, what does that cover?
That's everything. Land-based missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and the big long-range bombers. Anything that could carry a nuke to the other side's territory.
And crucially, it finally put limits on the MIRVs.
Yes, finally. It placed very specific restrictions on how many warheads could be put on certain types of missiles. It also required both sides to give a heads up before they did certain missile tests.
To reduce the risk of someone mistaking a test for an actual attack.
Exactly. It was all about building confidence and reducing the chance of an accidental war.
But not everyone was on board with this, especially in the U.S.
Not at all. There was huge opposition from conservative critics in the Senate.
What was their main argument? Why fight a treaty that's supposed to make things safer?
They felt it was an unequal deal. They argued it locked in certain Soviet advantages in heavy land-based missiles and that it restricted America's ability to develop new technologies.
So they just didn't trust the Soviets to follow the rules.
Pretty much. They felt the verification, even with satellites, wasn't good enough to catch a determined cheater. It was a really deep ideological fight.
And all that disagreement really slowed things down. The leaders signed the SALT Treaty in Vienna in June 1979. But for it to become law in the U.S., it needed to be ratified by the Senate.
And that's when the political window just slammed shut. Tensions were already rising, but then in December of 1979, the Soviet military invaded Afghanistan.
And that was it.
That was it. Diplomatic relations just collapsed. The U.S. president pulled the treaty from the Senate. It was dead on arrival. SALT II was never ratified.
But here's the really fascinating part. Even though it wasn't law, both sides, they still followed the rules, didn't they?
For several years, yes. They voluntarily chose to abide by its limits, which just proves that the core ideas, the need for limits, the need for verification, were seen as essential for stability, even when the politics failed.
So when you look back, what's the long-term impact of all this? The SALT process really changed how the world thought about nuclear safety.
It defined the rules of the Cold War. And it paved the way for even bigger treaties later on, like the START treaties, which led to actually destroying thousands of nuclear bombs.
The system of verification they invented back then is still the foundation for arms control today.
It is. These painstaking, difficult agreements, they genuinely reduce the fear of a sudden nuclear war for a whole generation. They prove that negotiation is always better than just letting the military competition run wild.
Every small step toward disarmament, even the imperfect ones, helps create a more stable world.
Absolutely.
Thanks for taking this dive into the history of arms control with us.
Good luck with your studies.